Hello students, I hope you are all fine and in good health. In this audio presentation, I will be discussing, rather to say I will be revising once again few important themes and characters related to the first chapter from Hornbill. The name of the chapter is The Portrait of a Lady by Kushwan Singh. So dear students, let's start. Overview of the chapter. As you all know, dear students, that the portrait of a lady is semi-autobiographical or to some extent autobiographical. It is actually an autobiography by Kushwan Singh, and this chapter deals with Kushwan Singh's grandmother. It is a perception of Kushwan Singh's grandmother. Kushwan Singh recalls his grandmother as an eternally old lady, even from the very beginning. From the very beginning of this chapter, we get to know that his grandmother was old and wrinkled. She was an extremely religious person. It was difficult for him to believe that once she too was young and pretty like other women. It was very hard for him to believe because from the very beginning of his life, he found his grandmother to be very old. The stories about her childhood games were like fairy tales to him. Not only that, even the childhood memories that his grandmother shared with him, the childhood games that his grandmother played with the other children when she herself was a young girl, was something very hard for Kushwan Singh to believe, because from the time of his birth till a certain point of time, he found his grandmother to be exactly the same. The Portrait of a Lady, as you all know, dear students, is a heartwarming pen picture of Kushwan Singh's grandmother who brought him up. Because when Kushwan Singh was a young boy, at that time Kushwan Singh's grandmother used to take care of him. Not only that, she used to take him to school for studies, and she and Kushwan Singh spent few years in the village also. Later, it was Kushwan Singh's parents who called them back to the city, but before that, they spent a few years in the village. The author describes his association with his grandmother and the changes that came about in their relationship with the passage of time. Their friendship was broken, or rather, to say in other words, if taking references from the text, their friendship was totally snapped with the passage of time. And after they went to the city, it seems that the bond that both Kushwan Singh and his grandmother, they both shared a very strong bond of friendship. That bond of friendship with the passage of time was totally broken or snapped, as I referred a bit earlier, when both of them moved to the city. Her simplicity and beauty left an indelible imprint on the author's mind. Now, it was the grandmother's simplicity, her religious nature, all these things after her death left an indelible mark or a great impression on the mind of Kushwan Singh. Now I am moving on to the next slide. The story The Portrait of a Lady by Kushwan Singh revolves around the story of the author and his relationship with his grandmother. Basically, the story The Portrait of a Lady by Kushwan Singh, it actually is related with a grandson's relationship with his grandmother. The author's grandmother, as we know, was a deeply religious woman, and she was very kind hearted also. She epitomized purity and peace of mind, which is very well written as an expanse of pure white serenity. Though she wasn't physically beautiful, she possessed deep spiritual beauty. her beauty was spiritual because she was very old. So she wasn't physically beautiful. She was once very beautiful and glamorous, but with the passage of time, her physical beauty faded away. But obviously, one thing is very important, dear students, that she possessed deep spiritual beauty. She took great delight in feeding the sparrows when they were transferred to the city, and while they were in the village, at that time she used to feed the village dogs. The story begins with the narrator describing how old his grandmother was. The thought of his author's grandmother being young and pretty in early years of her life raised a conflict in the mind of the author, because it was very difficult for Kushwan Singh to believe that once upon a time his grandmother was young and pretty. Her hair was white as snow, and she had a little stoop in her back. Now, two important things are to be noted also. First one, her hair was white as a snow, and she never used a stick. She had a little stoop in her back. So while she used to walk, she used to put one hand on her waist, and in her other hand, as she was deeply religious, she used to have a beads of rosary on her other hand. When Kushwan Singh was a child and his parents were away, he was brought up by his grandmother, who used to wake him up and get him ready for school. That was during the first phase of Kushwan Singh's life, when he spent few memorable years in the village. And it was Kushwan Singh's grandmother who used to accompany Kushwan Singh to the village school. While performing these daily tasks, she used to sing prayers which she wanted him to learn by heart, but in vain, because Kushwan Singh was never interested in learning the prayers. But obviously, one thing attracted him a lot, that was his grandmother's melodious voice when she used to recite those prayers. That was something he liked a lot. But understanding the prayers, he never liked it. She would walk with him to and from his school. On their way back, they would throw chapatis to the village dogs. So it seems that the friendship was very strong. It was unbreakable, and they both used to go to school together, because the temple and the school are located side by side, and the village priest was the teacher also, and he was also the priest at the same time. And they used to come back from school together. At that time also, village dogs used to follow them, so she used to throw some chapatis at the village dogs. When his parents finally settled in the city, Kushwan Singh went to stay in the city with her. This was a turning point in the relationship he shared with her, because now Kushwan Singh got admitted to an English medium school, and life became more stressful for Kushwan Singh, because pressure of studies was there. And previously he was always with his grandmother, but now Kushwan Singh got a bit overburdened with his academic affairs, and unfortunately his grandmother couldn't meet with him regularly on a regular basis, just like they used to meet previously in the village. Like that, they never used to meet when they went to the city. And most importantly, another important thing was that, unlike in the village when the grandmother used to help Kushwan Singh with his studies, but in the city, the English medium school where Kushwan Singh got admitted, and the science and the other topics that were taught to Kushwan Singh, his grandmother couldn't help him in those things, because those things were above her head. She was formally educated, but she was not highly qualified, and that was a problem. That was the reason why she couldn't help Kushwan Singh with his studies. She disliked many things, even taught in the school. She could no longer help him with his lessons. A small gap had developed between them. she didn't accompany him to school any longer. And the most sad part was that Kushwan Singh used to go to school in a motor vehicle. And but previously in the village, his grandmother used to accompany him to school. But now a motor bus or a motor vehicle used to pick him up for school. Now I am moving on to the next slide. It is the introduction part. Now, as you all know by this time that it is an autobiography by Kushwan Singh. It is a part of his autobiography, we can say. In this autobiography, he draws a pen portrait of his old grandmother. He loves her immensely. He beautifully unfolds their friendship and how it goes under several changes. There were a lot of changes, several changes. In other words, the story is a loving tribute by a grandson Kushwan Singh to his old grandmother. As I told you all earlier, that only a few portion in the first page belongs to Kushwan Singh's grandfather, whereas the rest of the portion is related with Kushwan Singh and Kushwan Singh's grandmother, particularly about Kushwan Singh's grandmother. It is a realistic account of how grandparents give all their time, love and attention to their grandchildren. So basically it is a story of love, deep emotion, attachment. And there is another important thing that we find here, that grandparents, they give all their time, love and attention to their grandchildren, but at some point of time there is a separation. That also we find in this particular chapter. Now I am moving on to the next slide. The Portrait of a Lady describes a very special bond that was between Kushwan Singh and Kushwan Singh's grandmother. That is, or in other words, we can say between grandson and grandmother. Kushwan Singh narrates how the relationship develops over the years and changes as the grandson grows up and the grandmother grows older. The grandson also grows up, and simultaneously the grandmother also grows older. Two things became her companions in the last phase of her life. Number one, solitude, and number two, silence. Now, solitude and silence fill the grandmother's days as she distances herself from the real world. She now prefers the company of the gods and the birds. She enters a world of her own, and she used to be very quiet. She never used to expose her grief, or she never used to expose her emotions as such. She enters a world of her own and is content with herself. She was very satisfied with herself. She used to be in her own world. She never used to complain. She never used to accuse anyone. She used to hide her emotions. She, at the end of the day, we can say she was very strong in her personality. Now, what is the message we are getting from this particular chapter, or from this particular story? The story portrays a grandson's perception of his grandmother and how their bond of love undergoes changes. And obviously, with the passing of time, or with the passage of time, the phases or the stages in their relationship also underwent a lot of changes. The story puts light on the need of companionship and friendship felt by our elders. It also shows how love and emotion is experienced not only by human beings but animals and birds too. Now, a clear example of that was we find at the very penultimate climax of this particular story, when the grandmother had died and the sparrows, they all assembled. But after the death of the grandmother, and when her body was taken for cremation, and after her body was taken, the sparrows all flew away. And another important thing is that Kushwan Singh's mother had given them some breadcrumbs, but they haven't eaten a single of that. They haven't eaten any of those breadcrumbs. Okay, and the sparrows, they had genuine love for Kushwan Singh's grandmother. Now, character sketch, the other important thing that you all have to know. The first and foremost, the most important character is obviously that of Kushwan Singh's grandmother. So in this story, the Kushwan Singh describes his grandmother as old woman. People said that she had once been young and beautiful, but according to the author, her grandmother had been old ever since she had seen her. The author could not imagine her as a child or as a young and a beautiful lady, because from the very beginning, Kushwan Singh saw his grandmother to be old and wrinkled, and it was extremely difficult, very, very hard for Kushwan Singh to imagine that she was once a child, or rather, it was very hard for Kushwan Singh to imagine that once upon a time she was young and beautiful also. For him, she was his grandmother, a woman who had always been old and never young, a woman who had always been old and never young. And that was the reason from the very outset, from the very beginning of this particular story or of this particular chapter, we find that she was old and wrinkled. She was always old, and it seems that she was never young. But scientifically, that is not possible. She was once young as a child, very beautiful lady. She got married also, but for Kushwan Singh, all these instances, all these episodes, real episodes related with his grandmother's life, it was very hard for Kushwan Singh to imagine, because from the very, very beginning of his own life, he saw the same image of his grandmother. And what was that image? Old and wrinkled. The author's grandmother was strong woman in character, very strong. She used to be very upset, but she never used to show her emotions to others. She was very, very strong, and she used to be very quiet. She used to stay in her own world, and that world was related with gods and animals. The author's grandmother was strong woman in character, as I told you all right now, and she was deeply religious too at the same time. She was always dressed in spotless white dress, and obviously she was a widow, so obviously she used to dress in spotless white salwar, or we can say in a spotless white dress. Now I am moving on to the next slide. In his childhood years, the narrator lived with his grandmother. We all know about it. And the narrator used to study in a village school. He describes her as a good friend, and their bond of friendship was unbreakable. And they were very much always with together. They were always together, and it was inseparable friendship. She would wake him up on school days and prepare him a simple breakfast. She had a sympathetic attitude towards animals, and that was the reason the village dogs used to follow them on a regular basis, and she used to feed them with chapatis. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. When she was in village, she used to feed dogs, but as and when she came to the city, the friendship from the dogs were replaced by the sparrows, and she started feeding the sparrows in the city. She was a very religious woman, as she spent her time in temple in reciting or reading the scriptures. She was a woman who loved her traditions and culture. With her one hand, she was always telling the beads of her rosary, and she used to balance her body with her other hand that she used to put on her waist. She used to stoop a bit while she used to move on. She was like the grand old lady of the house. She was always telling the beads of rosary. She spent most of her time reading the holy books, whether at home or in temple. She spent her time in spinning wheel and reciting her prayers. She never omitted to sing her prayers. Only once she did, and that was at the very end when she was about to die. She stopped praying. That was something very unusual. Now I am moving on to the next slide. Kushwan Singh, the narrator in the story, the portrait of a lady, was a sensitive and observant person. He cherished the memories of his association with his grandmother. He has beautifully described the details about many episodes from his past life that were related to his grandmother. This Portrait of a Lady, this chapter is indeed very memorable because in this chapter, Kushwan Singh, like a collage of pictures, described many memories that was interconnected or interrelated with his grandmother. The narrator's grandfather, we only got to know a few things about him related with his portrait that was near the mantelpiece. That was also, we can say, it's a very memorable character, but the important thing is that only few lines were written related with his grandfather, because the entire chapter, as I already referred to you all, it is related with Kushwan Singh's grandmother. So the narrator's grandfather also looked like a 100-year-old grand old man in the picture. He had a long white flowing beard. It came up to his chest. It looked as if he had lots and lots of grandchildren. But it is very difficult to imagine that once he married and once he was a handsome young man or a gentleman. But because in this picture it seems that he is more favorable to be the grandfather or the grand old man rather than a dashing young husband. Actually, he looked older than the grandmother, and on close perspective, on close looking or inspection at the picture, it seems that he looked much older than the grandmother. Now, the final conclusion part. So, the fact that generation gap is not an unbridgeable gulf is marked by the wave of nostalgia. Nostalgia is something that is related to the past, and obviously, they have developed a generation gap, as we find in this particular chapter, between Kushwan Singh and Kushwan Singh's grandmother. Initially, they used to they used to be very strong in their friendship. They were not separable at all initially, but later, when Kushwan Singh and his grandmother moved to the city, the generation gap became much more wider and wider with the passage of time. So I repeat the lines. The fact that the generation gap is not an unbridgeable gulf is marked by the wave of nostalgia that overwhelms us when we think of the simple and serene days spent with parents and grandparents during our childhood. Our childhood, we had spent many peaceful and serene days with our parents and grandparents. Kushwan Singh's story is an effort to celebrate those childhood years spent with his grandmother. Those were memorable years, and he used to relish and cherish those memories a lot. The story highlights the various phases of their relationship. Not only that, the conventions which are still prevalent in our country when it comes to elderly people, and how those patriarchal conventions affect our perception of our grandparents. Now that is also something very important, that the dogmas, the patriarchal conventions, all these things also affected, it affects our thinking perspective, our ideology, our sense of perception towards our grandparents. But Kushwan Singh had spent many memorable childhood phases with his grandmother in the village. But later, as I already referred to you all earlier, as they moved to the city, it seems that their friendship was totally snapped. It was totally broken, and that generation gap, which is also a very important theme in this particular story, it got widened. Now, that is it, dear students. Thank you, everyone. Now, you all will listen to this audio, I do presume, and if there is any problem anywhere, let me know about it. Thank you, students. Thank you all.